Well, hello everybody. Thank you for coming here tonight or watching from home, wherever you may be, all the thousands of you. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. My name is Bob McMaster, and I go way back in Southbridge and way back in the Jacob Edwards Library. The first time I came here was with Miss Foley's second grade from Eastfield Road School, and I've been coming here on and off with a few hiatuses in there ever since. So tonight I'm going to talk about Edward Hitchcock. Western Massachusetts has a lot of historic figures that have become icons. Emily Dickinson, for instance, from Amherst. Mary Lyon from South Hadley, that pioneer of higher education. Jonathan Edwards, that fiery preacher from Northampton. And this man, Edward Hitchcock. He was a poet, a playwright, a professor, a preacher, a philosopher, a paleontologist, and a president of a college. I don't know how many more P's there could possibly be, but he was all of those things. And while Emily Dickinson has had many biographies written of her, some of them rather fanciful, I think, and Jonathan Edwards quite a few, and Mary Lyon a few, I was surprised to find a few years ago that there had never been a biography written of Edward Hitchcock. And that's when I started my research, and just last year my book came into print. It's called All the Light Here Comes From Above, The Life and Legacy of Edward Hitchcock. Edward was born in Deerfield in 1793. He and his 5 siblings grew up in that house, which is still standing on the campus of Deerfield Academy, and they all attended Deerfield Academy, which was housed in that building, which still stands in Deerfield today. It's the Memorial Hall Museum. In fact, his oldest brother, Henry, was in the very first class to attend Deerfield Academy when it opened its doors in January of 1799. Edward attended Deerfield Academy for just a part of 6 years, 1804 to 1809, and that was the full extent of his formal education, if you can imagine that, just parts of 6 years at Deerfield Academy. Amazing considering his accomplishments. Well, just 7 years after he left Deerfield as a student, he came back as the headmaster. A meteoric rise. They called it preceptor. Now, Deerfield was a very progressive institution for its time. It believed in the equal education of men and women, but not in the same room at the same time. God forbid. And so there was a preceptress who taught the female students, and her name was Ora White. She had already been at the academy for a while. They became co-workers, they became friends, and they became much more, as we shall see. Ora grew up in Amherst. She was very well educated in the decorative arts, is the one phrase used at the time, as well as in math and science. But she was also a devout Orthodox Christian, a Calvinist, roughly equivalent to what we would call a Christian fundamentalist today. And she converted Edward to fundamentalism while they were at Deerfield Academy together. He grew up in Deerfield, which was a Unitarian town, and the polar opposite of this Orthodox Christianity. So she really turned his head around, I guess you'd say, in more ways than one, because of course they eventually married. Edward's tenure was brief at the academy. He was dismissed in 1818, not because of any shortcomings on his part, but because the academy was in financial troubles. There was a national recession in 1818, 1819, and they had to close their doors. And so Edward was without work for a few months. During that time, he published his first major scientific publication called Remarks on the Geology and Mineralogy of a Section of Massachusetts on Connecticut River. It was published in this new journal called the Journal of Arts and Sciences, published at Yale, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. He had a very detailed geological map of the Connecticut Valley, probably the most detailed geologic map ever drawn for any place in the United States at the time. The following spring, Edward traveled to New Haven, and he spent 7 weeks attending classes with Professors Benjamin Silliman and Eleazar Fitch at Yale, not as an enrolled student, but just as what we would call an auditor today. Silliman was a geologist and chemist, and also editor of that journal that Edward had published that article in. And Eleazar Fitch was a nationally known theologian. Yale was a decidedly fundamentalist or decidedly orthodox institution at that time. It shouldn't surprise us because the president was Timothy Dwight, and he was the grandson of Jonathan Edwards, the guy from Northampton, the preacher from Northampton. So it was still very much in that fundamentalist persuasion, you might call it. And so Yale was fundamentalist, and Harvard Divinity School was Unitarian, and the two had a sort of a battle for the souls of the people of New England for decades there. And Edward Hitchcock was right there when this was all beginning to get started. He, probably through Professor Fitch, he was invited to give a sermon, to deliver a sermon at a church in West Haven, his first sermon he ever preached. And afterwards he wrote in his personal notes, "Felt much solicitude, diffidence, and weakness in this first effort in the pulpit, but have much reason to be grateful that utterance was given me. I feel fearful that my lungs never will permit me to preach long, should I live to complete my studies." Well, that's pretty funny, because he preached, this was the first of over 1,000 sermons that he preached in his lifetime, and a lack of utterance was never a problem for Edward Hitchcock. When he came back to Deerfield, now Edward Hitchcock had a new voice and a new vocation. He was now Edward Hitchcock, itinerant preacher. And he traveled up and down the Connecticut Valley in a horse-drawn buggy, there he goes there, filling in for ministers in what was called pulpit supply, and even to this day, Congregational Church has what they call pulpit supply, where part-time ministers are brought in to substitute for a sick or absent minister. And you can see he was very popular. He delivered 108 sermons in 2 years. And in some places like Springfield, he delivered 6, in Longmeadow 5, in Deerfield 9, in Brattleboro 15 different times. But the jackpot is for Conway, Massachusetts, where he delivered 30 sermons in those 2 years. And the reason was the frail condition of John Emerson, the pastor in that church in Conway. And so, not surprisingly, he eventually was awarded the post. They called him junior pastor for a while, but then Reverend Emerson passed away, and he became the senior pastor. Well, he was called, as they say, in May of 1821. A few weeks later, he and Ora were married in Amherst in a tavern, which is just boggles my mind to think that this devout couple would be married in a tavern, but there's probably an explanation, but I don't know what it is. And moved with all their goods and chattels to the little town of Conway up in the foothills of the Berkshires. They lived in that house, which still stands in Conway to this day. Now, Hitchcocks were in Conway for 4 years. About a year after they moved there, their first child, little Edward, was born. Edward Hitchcock was very popular as a preacher. Ora was very popular as the preacher's wife. And they really loved Conway and thrived there. But then tragedy struck. Now, Edward Hitchcock was not one to introduce personal matters into his sermons. So you can imagine the reaction of the congregation on March 24th, 1824, when in a sermon entitled "The Sovereignty of God," he said this: "Thus far I had preceded my hearers in the composition of this discourse, when I was called away to witness in the prostrated agonies and final removal of an only child, a painful exhibition of the sovereign dominance of Jehovah." In other words, little Edward had died. There's his grave still in existence there in Conway. And the next line from that same sermon is very striking to me, very revealing about Edward and Ora. He said, "If there is one feeling within us stronger than the rest, It is a sense that we deserve that punishment, and it lends smarting poignancy to the wound to know that the arrow which has pierced us passed first through the heart of our child. It's hard to imagine how a couple who are suffering the pain of the loss of their first child would also bear the burden of guilt that somehow they were responsible for that child's death. But that was the nature of Edward and Ora's faith. About a year and a half later, in October of 1825, Edward resigned his pastorate. So this was March of '84. A year and a half later, he resigned. Why did he resign? He told his parishioners that it was because of his health. But even he admitted years later that that was not entirely the story. For one thing, he and Ora probably found life very painful in Conway after the loss of their little boy, although by 1825 there was a second child on her way. But also during that 4 years that Edward preached in Conway, he published 20 scientific papers, in that most of them in that journal that I mentioned. 20. So you get a sense that his interest in science was competing with his devotion to the ministry. And of course, the third factor there was that he was offered a post at Amherst College. And so they left Conway in October of 1825. And for the next 36 years, or 37 years, Edward was a professor at Amherst College. He taught chemistry, mineralogy, geology, natural history, botany, and Bible studies. Now, Amherst College was founded as an institution for training young men for the Christian ministry. So you can imagine how he thought this would be an ideal position for him, where he could continue both his interests, his scientific interest, and his ministerial pursuits, and his preaching, of course. Geology was his first love. He taught geology 37 years in a row, every single year, including the 9 years that he was president. So he was devoted to his geology. The couple moved into this house in 1828, still stands adjacent to the campus, and there they raised their 6 other children: Mary, Catherine, Edward Jr., Jane, Charles, and Emily. Beginning in 1829, Edward kept what he called his private notes. Not exactly a diary, they were much more sporadic than that, but they were lots of reflections on his work, on his family, on his faith. And the constant theme through these notes, in almost every entry, there's reference to poor health and his imminent death. In 1833, he wrote, "If his providence does not save me, I shall soon be in my grave." And a year later, "Perhaps my present state of health is only a short respite from the grave." And then in 1847, while he was president, he said, "The college will rise and flourish, but I must die soon." And in 1859, "The probability is faint of my seeing another year, and I long to be prepared to go." Now you might think that I think you could say that he was consumed with his fear of illness and of death, maybe even obsessed with it. And you might think that somebody with that kind of those kinds of fears would have a hard time getting up in the morning, have a hard time functioning. But exactly the opposite was true of Edward Hitchcock. It motivated him. His thinking was, I've got to get busy because I've got all this work to do, all of these things that God put me on this planet to do, I've got to finish. And so it actually became a strong motivating principle for him. Well, in 1830, he took on a vast new project. That was a geological survey of Massachusetts. He wrote to the governor, Levi Lincoln, in May of that year, proposed this idea. A month later, Lincoln had approved it, the legislature had approved it and funded it, and he'd been selected for the job. Over the next 4 years, he traveled all over the state conducting this survey. In 1830 alone, here's the route that he followed. There he goes through, and he traveled through Southbridge and Sturbridge, and I'll talk about that in a moment. It's a total of 1,600 miles just in a few months in 1830. Visited 150 cities and towns in the state. And that was only the beginning. The next 3 years, he traveled all over the state to practically every city and town. And here's some notes from his survey. There's over 400 pages of notes. But on the very first page, here it is, July 29th, 1830. He was just setting out from Amherst, and he made some notes to himself, possibly before he left Amherst. Note, Otis McClintock keeps the public house in Sturbridge. And note, Mr. Felch in Southbridge is a literary man who goes about the country with a solar microscope. That's kind of an interesting image. And Mr. Dunbar, near the meeting house, digs a mine. So those were, I think, people that he planned to visit with. Well, that night he stayed at a public house in Sturbridge. So we can imagine that it was the public house, although that term was used in those days to refer to any tavern or inn. And the next day, where did he, was the first place he visited? No surprise, right? He went right to the famous lead mines, the Tantius lead mines. And he had quite a bit to say about them in his notes and in his final report. Here he says, Plumbago mine, 2 miles north of the Connecticut line, a bed whose greatest width is about 2 feet, often dwindling down to nothing. Bed has been traced nearly 100 rods. Dug in some places to the depth of 60 or 70 feet. 100 tons have been dredged since the present proprietor, Mr. Tudor of Boston, has been engaged in the direction. And that's from his final report of some years later. And there's some pictures from other sources, old and new. And he went on in his 1833 report to say, this substance about graphite, plumbago, or black lead has the color of lead, leaves a trace like that metal upon paper, and bears the common name black lead, but it contains no lead. It is composed of 90% of carbon and the rest of iron and earthy matters. He says, in Massachusetts, it exists in gneiss, that's the metamorphic rock, at the most important locality, which is in Sturbridge. And he goes on to say the quality is excellent and would not suffer by comparison with any in the world. And graphite is employed for pencils, crutches, lubricating machinery, crucibles, lubricating machinery, etc. So not surprisingly, he was very interested in the lead mines. The very next day, he came to Southbridge. And he wrote in his notes, there it is there, Southbridge. Nice rock, again that metamorphic rock, 2 miles south of the meeting house are extensive beds of bog iron. He was very interested in bog iron. He thought there was a great future for bog iron, which was excavated out of the bottoms of wetlands, a low quality source of iron. Near the meeting house, Mr. Dunbar has opened a decomposing ledge of rock of a variety of gneiss, probably full of pyritics. He says, from Sturbridge to Southbridge 8 miles, I came 6 miles so as to see the bog ore. So that seemed to be his big interest in Southbridge. In his collections, this was published, a catalog of his collections was published many years later, he listed about 10 different items from Sturbridge, all related to the lead mine, I believe, and a couple samples of the gneiss from Southbridge. The next Monday, he didn't work on Sunday, of course, but then was Monday, August 2nd, and he went to Purgatory Chasm in Sutton. You know, he was hitting all the familiar landmarks of geological interest around. And I love this little item that he put in his notes, and it appeared in his final report too. It gives you a little taste of the man's subtle wry humor. I met with a rattlesnake among these rocks, but as he kindly warned me that I was invading his dominions, I suffered him to retire into his den, and he suffered me to leave his precincts in peace, mutually willing to be rid of one another's company. One of his goals was to draw an accurate geological map of the state, and that he did in his 1833 report. It's a map that holds up very well compared to modern maps, although we have to keep in mind that the technology available to Mr. Hitchcock was limited to that, a geologist's hammer. Another goal, a very important goal from the point of view of the governor and the legislature, was economic. They wanted him to find new mineral resources that would be of great value to the Commonwealth. And I'm not sure that he was all that successful in that regard. I say that, first of all, because two of the things he stressed were granite and limestone, granite to the east and limestone to the west. Well, those were already being extracted to a great extent by 1830, so Hitchcock can't take any credit for those. He was very interested in coal, and he was convinced that the anthracite of Rhode Island and even that of Worcester, and he included the Blackstone Valley, would be considered by posterity, if not by the present generation, as a treasure of great value. And he made that point again and again. Well, I think it's safe to say that nobody ever made a dollar mining or selling Massachusetts coal or Rhode Island coal. There's coal down there, there's no question about that, but it's of inferior quality. And Hitchcock had no way of knowing what the future would hold for coal, and that much higher quality coal would be found elsewhere. Similarly for gold, he found some gold in a mine in Somerset, Vermont, and said how far south the gold may be found remains to be shown. May we not expect to find it near the Hawley mine of iron, since this is in talcose slate? Well, I don't know that much about Hawley, Massachusetts, but I'm pretty sure there was never a gold rush there, so I think he missed the mark there too. But that's not to say that Hitchcock's geological surveys weren't important. They're extremely important in a couple of respects. One is that it became a model that dozens of other states followed in the next few years. Here's just a list in the next 8 years, something like 16 or 18 other states started surveys, and they used Hitchcock's model explicitly in many of them. So he started a trend, and George Perkins Merrill said, Hitchcock's report marks an epoch in American geological work. So it was really groundbreaking in that respect. Now, one point I want to make here is that this New York survey in 1836, Hitchcock put in his name to work on that survey and actually started to. And it was this man who he conversed with about it, and I include, he was the governor of New York State at the time, and there's some letters between him and Hitchcock about the job. And why did I put his picture up here tonight?
Southbridge.
Because he's a native of Southbridge, right? Marcy Street's named after him. So one little link there. Hitchcock did not stay in that New York post for long, but he did. It's not shown here, but because it was much later. But Hitchcock also was hired to do the Vermont survey in the 1850s. Well, Hitchcock and many scientists of his day had the standing assumption that most of the features of the Earth's surface were sculpted by a great flood, the flood of Noah, the flood of the book of Genesis. And Hitchcock preached about that in his younger days. But as he traveled around Massachusetts and other places in New England, he soon began to question that. There were these grooves in rock, he called them diluvial grooves, meaning caused by water, all oriented in the same direction, a little west of north. And there were these giant boulders carried long distances from their source, all headed in the same direction. And he was particularly interested in the boulders, some of which were huge. Like this one here, he called it the Green Mountain Giant because it was in Whitingham, Vermont, only a few miles from the Massachusetts line. And it is huge, I can attest to that. There's a picture of me standing in front of it just a couple of years ago. It is awesome to behold. When he saw these boulders, and particularly trains of boulders, all trending in that same direction, and such huge boulders, he just could not imagine how water could have done this. And he wrote in his final report in 1833, making every allowance for the reduction of the gravity of these boulders when in water, I confess I cannot conceive how such a work could have been effected by this agency, meaning by water. Well, a few years later, this man, Louis Agassiz, published his landmark work on continental glaciation, and Edward Hitchcock was perhaps the first American geologist to publicly embrace continental glaciation, because now it explained the things that he'd been seeing perfectly well. Of course, Edward Hitchcock is most famous for those famous dinosaur footprints. In 1835, this man, James Dean, brought these slabs of sandstone to his attention, and as soon as Hitchcock saw them, he said they look like the tracks of birds. They've got the right number of toes, the animal is digitigrade, meaning it walks around on its toes, and it's bipedal. And he started traveling up and down the Connecticut Valley looking for more evidence of this, and he found localities for similar tracks as far south as almost New Haven and as far north as Gill, right on the Vermont line. Dozens and dozens of sites, hundreds, thousands in the end of specimens. And he published his first paper on the subject in 1836 with the avian, what I call his avian hypothesis, that these were the tracks of ancient birds. He made such a huge collection of these tracks that they built a special building for them in 1855 called the Appleton Cabinet at Amherst College. It's a dormitory today. But more recently, they've opened the Beneski Museum of Natural History at Amherst. And this place is fabulous. And if you ever get a chance to go there, if you're interested in paleontology or interested in Edward Hitchcock or interested in old bones and skeletons, this place is awesome. It really and truly is. They're so beautifully exhibited. And Hitchcock's tracks are beautifully, beautifully displayed. My book starts with a description of the day my father took me to the Pratt Museum of Natural History when I was about 10 years old. And it was a creepy old building, and the tracks were down in the basement, and hardly visible, no signs that I could remember, nobody else around. It was kind of eerie, and even this little 10-year-old thought, what a shame, you know. Well, his collections, his fabulous collections, are on beautiful display today, and they are visited by paleontologists from all over the world. And it's open to the public too, for free. It's fabulous. Why isn't it called the Hitchcock Museum of Natural History? Because Edward Hitchcock didn't give $5 million for it. But I don't think he would begrudge Mr. Beneski in the least for that. Well, the avian hypothesis was pretty controversial. You might say it ruffled a few feathers. For one thing, it set back the age of birds by a couple of 100 million years. That these birds, if they were truly birds' tracks in that stone, must have been present a couple of 100 million years earlier than anybody knew previously. Secondly, some of them were huge. This is one of Orr's drawings for one of his papers. And so his idea was controversial, and he received some criticism initially for it. But pretty soon, most scientists came on board and agreed that they were animal tracks, they were probably bird tracks or tracks of animals closely related to birds. But people, even today, you hear people say, why did Hitchcock insist on his avian hypothesis? But I don't think he insisted on it. I don't think that's the right word. He favored it because the evidence was there. It was the best explanation he could come up with for what he saw. But again and again, he admitted, he agreed, he confirmed that there could be other explanations. He wrote said in a speech in 1843 that there may have been animals in the red sandstone period of a different class, say reptiles, with feet so exactly like our present birds as some of the tracks on stone seem to be. It is easy to imagine. So he qualified his avian hypothesis again and again. Why didn't he call them dinosaurs? There's two very simple reasons he didn't call them. He didn't say, these are the tracks of dinosaurs. The first was the word hadn't even been coined when Edward Hitchcock started his research on them. And when it was coined by this man, Sir Richard Owen, in 1841, the organisms that Owen called dinosaurs could not possibly have been Hitchcock's track makers, right? They didn't fit at all. They had 4 feet. They were plantigrade like us. They walked on the soles of their feet, and the number of toes is all wrong. So I don't think there's any reason that we would expect Edward Hitchcock to associate his track makers with Dinosauria as it was known then. Of course, in the 20th century, the whole view of dinosaurs changed, and we now recognize dinosaurs as dinosaurs as some of them as ancestors of modern day birds. And in 1991, Martin Lockley, an eminent paleontologist, wrote, Hitchcock was right all along. The tracks were indeed those of special types of birds. And this man, Robert Baker, a very influential dinosaur expert, probably the foremost American dinosaur expert, has written, Hitchcock was the earliest and in many ways the best mind in dinosaur science. All of us 21st century students of the dinosaur-bird relations owe a tip of the hat to the Reverend Edward Hitchcock. So Hitchcock's reputation, if it was tarnished at all, was certainly revived in the late 20th century. In 1844, the fortunes of Amherst College were at a very low ebb. The college was practically bankrupt. The enrollment had gone way down. Morale was very low. The previous president had resigned, and the trustees turned to Edward Hitchcock. He was the man that they believed could save the college, the only one that could save the college. He had the trust of the trustees. He had the trust of the other faculty members. The public believed in him. The students believed in him. Everybody believed in Edward Hitchcock, except Edward Hitchcock. And in his inaugural address, he admitted this. He said, "But here it is right to confess that my judgment coincides with my feelings in the conclusion that I am unadapted to meet the present exigency." Imagine how that would have gone all over for his inaugural address. But then he added, "But I yield to the judgment of the trustees and friends of this college, so far as I know it to have been expressed, and cheerfully attempt the experiment in reliance upon the coadjutors, upon the liberality of the friends of the college, and above all, upon help from on high." Well, he may have gotten help from on high, but he also got some more earthbound help from this man and some of his peers. Samuel Williston was a business magnate from East Hampton, and the night before Hitchcock was inaugurated, he made the biggest gift ever to the college, $20,000, a lot of money in those days, and several other wealthy men followed in his heels, and very quickly the debt of the college was wiped out. And it was all because of their faith in Edward Hitchcock, even though he didn't have much of his own. Some years later, Hitchcock wrote, "Oh, what a load did these benefactions take from my mind." It's funny, Hitchcock hated asking for money. Which college president is going to survive who can't ask for money? But he almost didn't have to. It was just his character, his reputation was so strong that the money flowed. And it hadn't under his predecessor. The Hitchcocks moved into the president's house in 1845, somewhat reluctantly, and Ora became the first lady of Amherst College. And boy, it was lucky because she was a whiz. She was a marvel. Edward's, moods, swings were hard to deal with, but she floated over them and over life. And she was very adept at organizing big events. And they started having these receptions for students at the president's house, and really turned the college around. And so Ora was really Edward's salvation in so many ways. I wrote in my book, Ora was his anchor, his rudder, his keel. Without her steadying hand, her constancy, her faithfulness, his career would have had a very different trajectory. His life would likely have been shortened by decades. His soul buried in self-doubt and guilt. That ship would most certainly have foundered on the rocks. So that was the importance of Ora White Hitchcock. She was an artist in her own right, and she worked in all different sorts of media, and she made, I think, over 2,000 illustrations for Edward's books and his papers. And she also did this marvelous little album of mushrooms with Edward's help in 1822, and the original is still in the special collections at Smith College. And the colors, it's phenomenal how the colors have held up 200 years since she completed this. So anyway, the Hitchcock presidency lasted 9 years, enrollment doubled, the debt was retired, 4 professorships were added, 3 new buildings were constructed, and most importantly, harmony was restored within the college. William Tyler wrote, "The value of Dr. Hitchcock's presidency cannot be overestimated. His weight of character and his wise policy saved the college." So not only did he save Amherst College, but he also played an important role in the establishment and success of Mount Holyoke College. Remember Mary Lyon, she was a lifelong friend of the Hitchcocks, and when she established her college at South Hadley, Edward became a founding trustee, and he remained on the board for the rest of his life. And all 4 of their daughters attended Mount Holyoke. And Edward was also involved in the establishment of UMass, which was then known as the Massachusetts Agricultural College, although it didn't actually get finalized until after his death. He died in 1864, and the charter was approved in 1867. Well, Hitchcock's greatest mission in life, he believed, was to reassure scientists and people of faith that there need not be a conflict between science and religion. He felt this was his most important mission, his most important duty to his maker. And he published what he felt was his most important book, A Religion of Geology, in 1851. And in it he said, "The hostility between science and revelation, we believe, is only apparent, not real. When rightly interpreted and understood, they will appear in perfect unison." To put it simply, he believed that God guided this search for scientific truth just as surely as he guides the search for moral and spiritual truth. So he didn't see any difference between the search for truth in science and in other spheres. Of course, about just a few years later, this book was published, which made the debate over science and religion, put it into high gear. And that was The Origin of Species with Charles Darwin. And of course, a lot of people of faith were upset about this because it took the creative impulse away from God, you know. And to be honest, Edward Hitchcock wrote strenuously against Darwinism at first. But in the last few years of his life, you could see his thinking beginning to modulate, beginning to change. And in a very important paper he wrote just a year before his death, he wrote, "But after all, the real question is not whether these hypotheses accord with our religious views, but whether they are true." And then he wrote this, and this is really tantalizing: "The fact that these new creations are repeated at intervals and seem to form a part of a series of operations which we know to be natural makes it quite probable they also are natural. Perhaps this unknown law, in other words, evolution or natural selection, so on, this unknown law will be by and by be discovered, as many new laws have been, to explain phenomena once supposed to be miraculous because anomalous and inexplicable." In other words, he was keeping the door open. Maybe evolution, natural selection, the rise of new species was all a part of God's plan. In that respect, he was kind of a pioneer. And it's ironic because some people said he was the last of the Christian geologists, as if this was the end, you know, that these were people who allowed their faith, scientists who allowed their faith to constrain their science. But that wasn't Edward Hitchcock, and that's, I think, a really unfair characterization of him. On the contrary, I think based on this late writing, it would be correct to say that he was really a pioneer of a new breed of scientists that were comfortable with a God who oversaw the activity of laws such as natural selection and so on, and he didn't see a conflict there at all. So I think that's another area in which he's perhaps been mischaracterized and deserves some credit. And it's kind of interesting because we hear so much today, especially from people of fundamentalist faith, questioning science. And 200 years ago, Edward Hitchcock said, "I don't see a problem here." But, one last little vignette here is that late in his teaching career, a student told this story. Professor Hitchcock was starting a new semester with his class in a room that had previously been unlit, had no windows. And they'd put a skylight in it, and sunlight was shining through it. And Professor Hitchcock looked up at the light shining through that window and then smiled at his students and said, "Young gentlemen, all the light we have here comes from above." And I think that's a very perfect statement of a fundamental principle of the man, and where I got the title, "All the Light Here Comes from Above." Well, I will leave it there, except to point out that I have a website, www.edwardhitchcock.com, that has much more information than probably most people want to get about the man. It also talks about my book, of course. I want to especially point out this page, Hitchcockiana, which is a blog that I add to periodically. And there's several things you might enjoy there. There's an article called The Battle of the Titans, comparing Hitchcock and Louis Agassiz. They were very, very different men in so many ways, both very important. I call it the Agassiz and the ecstasy. There's a little bit more on those boulders I was telling you about. You might get a kick out of this story. The Hitchcock legacy lives on. Just a little over a year ago, I had the good fortune to sit down with Emily and Sawyer Hitchcock at Smith College. They are the great, 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 great grandchildren of Edward and Ora. And I tell in there about our conversation, and you find out, if you're curious, what they're doing with their lives today. There's also a section on the descendants of Edward and Ora that include their two sons who were both in academia. Edward Jr. was on the faculty at Amherst College longer than his father, in physical education actually. Charles was a geologist at Dartmouth for a long, long time. Emily was a botanical artist. Jane is a granddaughter who was a pioneer in community nursing at the turn of that century. Dr. John Sawyer Hitchcock was an MD who was the personal physician of Calvin Coolidge. And then in 1919, he was in Boston. He was the head of infectious diseases for the Mass Department of Health during the pandemic of 1919. So he was like the Anthony Fauci of 100 years ago. And that pandemic makes COVID look mild by comparison. I think the numbers that are involved. And Margaret Hitchcock Emerson, I put her in because she lived in Northampton. She looks like a modern woman there today, doesn't she? She attended Smith and graduated from Smith in 1920, and eventually she worked in the archives at Amherst College. So anyway, there's also some Zoom casts if you're interested in them, short ones, 15 minutes on different topics. Of course, Edward Hitchcock is also well known for the what we call Lake Hitchcock today. And everybody in the Connecticut Valley knows about Lake Hitchcock, which was the ancient glacial lake that flooded that whole valley. And no, he didn't name it after himself, and he didn't know anything about glaciers at that time. But he could see from evidence around the valley that there had been a great lake there one time. And he initially thought it was part of the deluge, but later on, when he started learning about glaciers, he made the connection.
And in Einstein's books, he talks about religion, and he had a quote very similar to Hitchcock's about that he had respect for that mysterious. There was something.
Yeah.
It's not that he, they always asked him about God because he was Einstein.
Right.
But he had seems like he had the same exact feeling. That he didn't want to put religion down at all.
Right, absolutely. And Francis Collins, who's the head of the NIH today, is a fundamentalist Christian, and he's written a book about his faith and his science. So as I say, I'd like to think of Edward Hitchcock as being, at some level, the beginning of a new tradition of sort of synthesis of science and religion. The book is available in print, as you know. It's also available as an e-book in a number of different formats. You can buy it from any of the big online retailers. I always encourage people to go to indie books, to go to their local independent bookseller, or Indie Books, which is a great place to find your local bookseller, and you can actually buy books online through your local bookseller. And Deb Horan over at Book Lovers Gourmet, who you told me about first, Margaret, some years ago, always has my books in stock there. So if you need a book for, the holidays are approaching and you need a gift, you could pick one up there. But you can also buy books from bookstores like the Book Lovers Gourmet online just as easily as you can Amazon or Barnes & Noble. And then I have my series of novels that some of you know about, and my new book will be coming out in October, Rose of Glencarry, and that's set in Ireland, so that's a whole new venture for me.
I really liked the references that you were able to insert for Southbridge, because it always makes it so appropriate for us here to listen to that. And I just find that fascinating, and that that we have so much geological interest in our area, actually, documented in the Quinnebog Valley Historical Society.
Yes, right. And this is geologically a very complex part of the state, probably the most complex. And You can see that on his maps. And as you many of you may know, my novels are set in the Holyoke area, but there's a lot of Southbridge background to them because Holyoke and Southbridge are very, very similar in a lot of ways. So some of the people, some of the characters, and some of the names actually come from Southbridge.
I would like to thank you very much, Bob, for coming this evening to make this presentation to us.
My pleasure.
It's a fascinating topic, and you certainly brought it to life here this evening. Copy of the book will be available, or is available at the library, but also there are other sources, as Bob has mentioned. And I just thank you again for remembering Southbridge and for putting us into the talk as well. So thank you again for a wonderful talk and for a great evening.
Thanks to all you folks here tonight. I hope I can speak to each one of you individually. And thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Good. He's good.
That's great. Well, that's really super. Thanks, folks.